Okay, we have a treat here today. A very good friend of mine agreed to do one of my interviews with me, and we're going to be discussing how the changes of the from the tradition or the true Catholic Church into the Novus Ordo happened for the everyday blue collar Catholic. Um, as a young boy, he actually saw it unfold in front of him, and I think it'd be an excellent perspective to hear from him on how that came to be because personally, I've been Eastern Rite my whole life, so I never actually saw any kind of drastic changes. But I've always been curious as to how the change actually occurred for the person in the pew in the 60s. I always had this fantasy that it was something like one day they came in, sat down, and it was the regular Mass, and then the next day they showed up, or the next Sunday they showed up, and it was a completely different Bizarro Mass. But that's not the case, is it, Philip?
No, it's not. It was very creepy, very gradualism.
All right, tell me a little bit about yourself. You're willing to tell when you were born and your uh, your Catholic faith that you. Go ahead.
Um, my Catholic faith, I was born in 1955, and I was baptized before the month was over, before a month was over, as was the common practice. Parents rushed to get their children baptized. Both my parents were serious-minded, practicing Catholics. My mother had even spent 1 year in the convent, considering a religious life. My father, of course, was a World War II veteran. My maternal grandparents were Catholic, and my maternal great-grandparents came to this country from Eastern and Central Europe, from what was Austria-Hungary then, and Russia, which later became part of Poland. My paternal grandparents came from Austria-Hungary also, what became they came before the First World War, what later became Romania. But they were of German ancestry, but they were all devout, serious-minded Catholics.
Were they Roman Catholic or Eastern Rite?
Well, we always thought they were all Roman Catholic. We have learned many years after going to the becoming traditionalist and attending the Eastern Rite Church, that some of our ancestors practiced their faith in the Eastern Rite Church on both sides. We never knew this. Some relatives, when my father passed away, about 22 years ago, the distant cousins came to his funeral here in Pennsylvania, and when he was being buried from the Greek Catholic Church, the Byzantine Catholic Church. It was a shock. They says, "Well, don't you know our ancestors attended the Byzantine Catholic Church, the Greek Catholic Church in Europe? We just never knew it." The reason they went to the Roman Church when they got here was, even though they attended the Byzantine Catholic Church in what is today Romania, they were German-speaking first, so they had to have somebody they could go to confession to. And none of the Eastern Rite churches here in America spoke German.
When they came, Philip, when they came to America, did they settle immediately in Pennsylvania or?
Oh, they settled immediately in the town I live in.
Okay.
My father's people came. My father's father came here in '05. My father's mother.
1905.
That's right. Yeah, not 2005. And my mother's family came here in the 1880s and the 1890s from Galatia, which is in southeastern Poland today and southwestern Ukraine.
And they've lived in this personal city you live in now the whole time?
The whole time. I have I'm in my pop's family. I'm the second generation born here in this town. In my mother's family, I'm the third generation, and we're up to the sixth generation was born here now. And but we've always resided here. some other branch of the family went to other places in the state and the country, but in this town, everyone lived, and everyone is buried in or around this town of all my ancestors in this country.
That's excellent. Brain, what is the earliest memory you have of going to Mass? If you can.
Well, that I can recall, I would say first grade. Although I remember one time earlier than that. So I might have been in kindergarten, but I would say 1960, the fall, because in those days the parents kept the children at home. My father would go to 5:30 Mass on Sunday, and my mother would go to 7 o'clock. And the purpose was we didn't have shots in those days. They wanted to keep us away from all the diseases. My parents were very conscious of this because of all the children that died in both my parents' families growing up. You know, they were very conscious of this.
Okay, but so you're saying you did or you didn't attend Mass with your parents?
I didn't. I attended Mass when I was in first with my parents one or two times when I was very small, and then we attended the children's Mass because we attended parochial school.
Right.
They had a 9 o'clock children's Mass, and the boys sat on St. Joseph's side or Our Lord's side, and the girls sat on the Blessed Mother's side of the church, and you sat each according to your grade, and there was a nun in the back of each grade keeping an eye on the kids. They behaved themselves in church.
You were about, what, 8 years old?
Oh, I was 6 years old.
6 years old, okay. And you remember?
No, I would say 5 years old even.
You remember?
5 years old.
You remember 5 years old in Mass?
Oh, yeah. I remember when I was, when I was 2 and a half, when my parents brought us to our home, when they moved there.
You have a memory of that. That's excellent.
Yes, I can describe things way back. I can describe, you name it, I can describe it.
Would you say, so the parish you attended, which will remain nameless unless you wish to mention it, the parish you attended, as you got older and your memories became more, vivid, would you say the churches were really very full, very attended?
Oh, the word is packed. And I mean packed like you couldn't believe. Our parish, being part of the baby boom generation, our parish we had a wonderful pastor there. When you were made pastor in those days, you were made pastor for life.
Right.
He went and had the basement of the church converted into a second church from just a plain cellar. He had a whole altar. He had 2 side altars. He had the baptismal font down there, a communion rail, and he brought all the pews from upstairs down there and put new pews upstairs. He done everything he could to accommodate the people.
Because of the overflow.
Oh, it was packed. Like I said, the only Mass that wasn't packed was 5:30 in the morning, because that had people that were working that had to go to Mass before they went to work. And my father, he preferred 5:30 because it wasn't as crowded.
Wait, is this daily Mass?
No, this is Sunday Mass.
Okay, and people work on Sunday because they had to?
On the weekday, they had 3 Masses. They had a 6 o'clock in the morning, they had a 7 o'clock in the morning, and they had an 8 o'clock in the morning. On Sunday, they had the 5:30, they had a 6:30, they had 7 o'clock, they had 8 o'clock, they had 9 o'clock, they had 10:15, they had 11:15, and then they had a downstairs. They had a 10:15 or 10 o'clock downstairs, and they had a 12 o'clock upstairs. That's what they had on Sunday. And one time I was coming across the street walking home with some of my siblings, and the church across the street from us was a Methodist church. And I'm waiting there, or I was coming to Mass, and the people were coming out from the 8 o'clock, and I was coming to the children's Mass. And the minister from that church, he's standing there with a visiting minister, and he comments, "This is the way they come and go every hour in this church."
This was from the Methodist.
Methodists, would that we could pack our church like that.
Would that they couldn't.
Yeah, well, they wish they could. They could.
We're glad we didn't.
This is how packed. This is how packed. Our church was the oldest and the largest Catholic parish in the town. It's still there, and there were two other Roman Catholic churches. The one parish was complete. Both parishes have been suppressed, and the other two parishes. The one was a Polish church, which was where my mother was baptized in. The other was a Latin Rite Slovak church around the corner from me. They finally closed that up last year. The building's sitting there. It's just horrendous what's happened to the Catholic faith church in this town.
Right. Well, but this, and I know the town. We're not mentioning it on purpose, but it's a relatively small town, and to have that many churches.
Oh, and then you had two Eastern Rite churches in this town on top of it.
Correct. Wow.
So you had 5 Catholic churches in a town when I was a boy of 35,000 people. That was the largest it ever got.
Is the population that big now today?
No, it's about 20 to 22,000. It's like World War II, but it's pre-World War II population now. But it's like all the Catholics still would come into the town to go to Mass, so you had the whole area around us. Right. And I mean, it was just, Catholicism was on the rise everywhere you looked. It was expanding. It was building. You had you had 3 Catholic parochial schools in town when I was a boy.
Right.
You had the one I attended, the German and Irish church with a little bit of everybody else in. You had the Polish parish, had its own parochial school, and then you had the Greek Catholic Church, Byzantine Catholic Church, and the Latin Rite Slovak. They had their own parochial school. They shared jointly with each other expenses and children, and the nuns that manned the Eastern Rite Catholic School were Byzantine Catholic nuns.
Okay, so without going for a long discussion about it, what is a Roman Catholic Slovak church? That's new. I don't think I've ever heard of it.
Well, it's like this. Geographically, you had the Czech part and you had the Slovak part, and a little bit of the Slovak was Roman Catholic, just a little bit,
right?
And Czech, and that primarily makes up the Slovak Roman Rite parishes. It was like in Europe. One side of the western side of the valley was Roman Catholic, and the eastern side of the valley was Eastern Rite Catholic. That's how the borders went, you know.
Interesting, and they had the Latin Mass in Latin, even though they were Slovak.
That's right, and interesting also, when our church was building its current building in the 1920s.
Which church? I'm sorry.
Which is only a block away from us, and the next street, a parallel to ours, 1 block over.
Philip, which church?
Our parish had its divine liturgy in the Latin Rite Slovak when they weren't having theirs on Sunday.
Okay, so you mean your current church?
Yes.
Okay.
The people, many of the families are interrelated.
Right. That's very interesting. I actually never heard of the Roman Catholic Slovak church. So
if you look on the cornerstone there, you'll see how it is. And of course the question is, who makes up what group? You know, it's linguistic.
Right. Yeah. Right. It's fascinating. Okay, but I want to try and focus still. My whole topic on this is, what was it like to go through the changes from Vatican II? Now, let's discuss the very first thing you remember that you could describe in your observation as a change, a novelty, or something from Vatican II happening that you remember.
The first thing I remember was they decided to take the maniple vestment off the arm of the priest.
The what? I'm sorry.
It was called the maniple.
Okay, and what is that? Fill us in.
Well, it was like I was trying to think on how to describe that recently, and the best way to describe it is here it is, the manipole. It's spelled maniple, and it was an ornamental vestment of colored silk or damask worn over the left forearm of the priest. Originally, this vestment was a handkerchief carried in the left hand or thrown over the left arm. It symbolizes the labor and hardship the priest must expect in his ardent apostolate.
Interesting. So you noticed the first
They
thing.
got rid of that. And that was from the time of the apostles. And the Eastern Rite Church has it with the bishop. It's that long card with the picture of our Lord hanging on his side when if you see it, the stained glass window or in a picture.
Right.
Its counterpart is found in the Eastern Rite vestments.
And we still have it.
And we still have it. It was taught by the Council of Trent. My teaching is that abandonment of any ecclesiastical tradition is tantamount to heresy.
Interesting. So, and you saying, did you notice this as a boy yourself, or did your parents point it out to you, or is this something?
I spotted it right away. I noticed it at some point, and everything was.
How old were you, Phil, at this time?
Well, I would say, I'd have to be past confirmation. I was confirmed when I was 9. I would say 9, 10, 11, 12 or 13, somewhere's in there.
Okay.
Somewhere's in there, because I was talking to one of my siblings, and he was confirmed. I was confirmed in March of '64, and by the auxiliary bishop, the late John Graham of the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, and so was my brother 2 years later. So he was confirmed in '66. So, and we know nothing was changed in the church's appearance till after my one brother was confirmed.
Well, it's interesting to note that at that year I was literally 1 year old.
And
but I was actually confirmed already, since I was born in the Eastern Rite.
That's right.
And confirmed at baptism.
That's right. That's right.
So that was a very minor change, and wow, I mean, something very subtle that probably most people wouldn't have noticed.
No, well, they called it wasn't needed. It wasn't needed. That was their excuse. It really wasn't needed. It had no use for
That sounds
purpose.
familiar.
That
sounds
I'm
very
sorry.
Familiar.
It was a tradition of the church that went back over. It went back from the time of the catacombs.
Okay.
And
what next?
Then, of course, what I also noticed then was, like, in 5th grade, we were, if you wish to, they taught you to become an altar boy. And
you
they
did.
And they were teaching me to respond in Latin. Okay?
Right.
And then, in the middle of them training us, they shortened the prayers at the foot of the altar.
The Latin prayers?
Yes. See, this was some of their subtle changes. First, they decided, well, we're going to shorten some of these prayers at the foot of the altar. There's going to be changes. But see, it wasn't a new Mass yet.
Right.
And then suddenly, well, now we're going to be allowed to say the Mass in English.
Who was the Pope?
It still wasn't the new Mass.
Who was Pope then? Paul VI?
Paul VI was Pope by then. As my late grandmother used to call Mr. Ecumenical Man, John the 23rd was already gone. She called Mr. Ecumenical Man. That's what she used to say. With her She
Okay.
should see it now.
Okay. So on the timeline here we are. Okay, they've changed a rubric, I guess, right?
Mm-hmm. They changed the rubrics, and see at the same time by then, see we're at let's see, we're at 67,
Okay.
and the pastor at our parish was an exemplary priest. He was ordained in 1927.
What was his name?
His name was Father William Begley. They made him Monsignor. He came from a well-to-do family, and he just poured his own personal money in to help the parish every which way he could. The parochial school, he built a new school for the children. He built a new convent for the Franciscan sisters. He done everything possible to improve the church. And he went and he saw the direction they were saying they were taking the church with what was going to be the new liturgy, the new mass, and he had the Catholic understanding of what they were doing, which is how they snow jobbed everyone. And he had the church
Explain that.
redone.
What do you mean by that? He had
Well,
the
this is
Catholic.
what I
This
mean.
is how they snow job. Explain that.
They had it that we are going to have a new mass, but my mother came back from a meeting, and we're going to convert all the people in these other churches in town back to the Catholic faith.
The Protestants.
That's right.
That
We're going
was
to have the
their.
mass in English. They're going to understand it. We're going to bring the people back to the faith. This is the line they gave us. And of course, if they would have simply went to the other side of the prayer book or your missal and read the prayers as they were in Latin, there would have been a couple corrections that were incorrectly translated in the old books, but they weren't serious mistakes. If they would have done that, at least they would have had a complete destruction of Catholic meaning. But they had other intentions, some people.
Yes, we know.
Now, not our
right.
pastor. When he built the new altar, it's obvious it's an altar. It's not a table. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
And everything this pastor did, there was total reverence with the Eucharist. Another example, what they later on did was, now, when I was a boy, the large mass, especially the children's mass, one of the assistants would always come and help distribute Holy Communion.
Right.
And of course, everyone knelt for Holy Communion at the communion rail. They had a little glass, we'll say small, like little glass jar, we'll say about an inch and a half high, that was on the altar. It stood to the right of the tabernacle and had a gold or silver lid on it with a cross. And that was taken, opened up, and the priest who assisted in giving out communion put his fingers and washed his fingers in that after he gave communion, because he wasn't involved in the ablutions after the communion.
Right.
And
well, I want to.
So they got rid. Eventually, they kept that. Eventually, they got rid of that. That was another sign they lost reverence for the Eucharist. They weren't as particular as they were with every little particle of the Eucharist. And of course, the Latin Rite Church, the Roman Rite Church, has the distinction that it gave communion on the tongue with just one form, so the priest's fingers were handling the host. Whereas in the Eastern Church, it's a gold spoon distributes the sacred species of our Lord.
Right. Well, I don't want to get off track on that. So because I'm still very fascinated about the actual changes, how they actually appeared before you as a Catholic.
Well,
let's go back. So right now where we are is that you're in learning to be an altar boy, and you're learning the Latin to do the proper responses, and then you said in the middle of that training something changed? Is that right?
Yes, in the middle of the training, we no longer have to learn any Latin.
Oh my.
And by then they had
already
Latin? Shortened the prayers at the foot of the altar.
Right, they had shortened the prayers, and now you don't even have to learn Latin.
Now we don't have to learn Latin. It's all done away with.
How were you told
And,
that?
pardon?
How were you told that?
Uh, the boys that were, they would have the older boys teach the younger boys how to serve. And they came in one day and they were instructed, had been instructed by the priest, we no longer have to learn Latin. It's all done away with.
Now, where was Vatican II at this time in the timeline in your life? Like, was it still going on as a council, or was it closed?
Well, by then, let's see, I would say in the timeline, Vatican, well, Pope John the 23rd was already deceased. Because he started the council, but
Right.
it did not come to an end before he died.
And he even begged for it to end. Is that correct? That's what I heard.
Pardon?
And he even begged for it to end.
I was instructed later by a priest that he made certain them swear they would not change the liturgy. And my understanding at this time is still that in nowhere in the documents of Vatican II does it say that the priest should face the people when saying Mass, and that Latin was to be kept in pride of place, meaning it was supposed to be kept first important.
Right. Well,
And
we understand the mechanism of how they're able to get around all that. But right now I'm trying to get to the timeline. So as a 12 or 13-year-old, they've changed, they shortened prayers, and then now they're changing from Latin to English.
And when the church was redone, the priests now face the people.
Right. Now I'm going to get back to that because that's really a crucial one for me. But before we get back to that, where would you say the council was at this time that we're talking about? Would you say it's closed, or it's just about to close, or is all this?
I would say
it has to be closed, right?
I don't think it's still completely closed then. I think it didn't. I don't think. Well, the new Mass was promulgated for 69. So I think about 67 is when the council closed, but I'm not sure of the date.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. But,
so it's very close to
but it's very odd to me. It's very odd to me that they would make such dramatic changes coming out of a council before it's completed.
Well, that's a good point there.
Because obviously it shows that they had a pre-agenda.
Well, that's the way it appears.
Right.
Again, I'm not sure of the exact date. I wish I knew the exact date.
That's okay. It's not a test.
Hey, Humane Vitae came out after the council closed, did it not?
Yes.
All right, well, no, that came out in 68, so 67 or early 68 is when the council was closed. So this is right around the same time I'm taught this as I'm being taught as an older boy.
Now, did you proceed then in your training to be an altar boy?
Oh yes, I served. We've said prayers at the foot of the altar, even though the priest faced the people.
Talk to me about that. All right, now I'm ready. Let's talk about that. So one Sunday, the priest is facing the proper way.
Mm-hmm.
And then what? The following Sunday? Did he? I mean, was it drastic?
It was gradual, very gradual.
But how do you gradually?
They were refurbishing the church, and they had one old altar they kept in the church and ripped everything apart and put new in. And
so you had two altars. You had two altars in the church.
Yeah, and then the downstairs church where the priest said Mass during the weekday, it remained for the longest time afterwards with only one altar with back to the people, and I assisted the priest there, including the pastor, serving the Mass and helping him there at the altar. You had everything, there were certain prayers at the foot of the altar. You had the basic prayers. I will go the sign of the cross, and I will go into the altar of God, the God who gave the joy to my youth. Our help is in the Lord who made heaven and earth. And then maybe he went up the step, saying the quiet prayer, or the confiteor might have still been set. I'm not sure at that point right now.
Philip, remind me never to
It was shortened late.
Philip, remind me never to upset you. Your memory is fantastic. Remind me never to get on your bad side because you won't forget. Your memory is excellent. Um, what I
Okay.
want to get at then. So you have at this parish. Then let me see if I'm describing it correctly. You tell me if I'm wrong. So you have two areas for mass to occur. An upstairs and a downstairs. The upstairs one was beginning to be refurbished, and the downstairs one was not.
That's right.
Okay, and then the upstairs one ended up with the centralized altar of the Novus Ordo as well as the original traditional altar. Is that correct?
No.
No.
The traditional altar was all taken away.
How'd that happen? How did they get?
Well, they just took it all down, and they did up marble. They put up a life-size or bigger than life-size crucifixion of our Lord, and they put that against the back wall, and they had an altar fashioned into the marble with the tabernacle central. They could not move the tabernacle out of center in that church.
At that time.
And they never did.
Okay, so even today they still haven't done that.
That horrible thing. That church, yes. Now downstairs they don't even have a tabernacle, man. They ripped everything out completely. It's worse than worse.
Okay, all right. We'll get to modern times at the end of this, but forgive me for interrupting. So I'm trying to get this down in my own head. So I'm curious. I'm in construction, so I'm curious as to how quick it was that they renovated your church.
Oh, it was, I would say, a process of nearly a year to get everything done that they were doing.
But I mean, didn't that bother anybody? Wasn't there any uproar from the people? Like, you can't do that. Our parents donated that.
This is the way Father Begley was. Everything Father Begley did, he came to the people. He talked to the people like a good father should. Now, this is what we'd like to do, and I need your help. We're going to have changes in the church. And everything, he was so good to the people, so thoroughly orthodox and Catholic in his mindset.
And trusted.
I mean, nobody disrespected Father. Few people disliked him, but they kept generally their dislike or their gripe to themselves. You know what I mean? It was very private. There was a respect to him. He came. The people in this town were always poor, for the most part. He came in after World War II, and he was pastor there for over 20 years. And the only reason he retired was he got too ill to go on. Because in those days, a pastor was never to be removed. Once he was made pastor, he was there for life.
Right.
And Father Begley came from a family of money, and he lavished his own personal
So what
money
you're saying, what you're saying is, Phil, and this is kind of a criticism I have of these early days, and some of my friends. I understand that he was a holy and good and great pastor. But these changes, and I guess in your opinion, you feel he was deceived because of his obedience. His love for the church and obedience for the church was deliberately used against the church.
That's exactly right. If Father Begley would have got up in the pulpit and denounced Vatican II and the changes, the whole parish would have refused.
Well, then why didn't he?
Because he believed in he trusted the hierarchy, just like we trusted the hierarchy.
Right.
And we had Cardinal Crowe as Bishop of Philadelphia. Even the traditionalists respect him. That there's no doubt of the validity of any priest he ordained. He was one of two bishops that refused to allow Saturday evening Mass in his diocese until a pope corrected the wording on it, and he was theologically correct. And then, I'll tell you one more about Cardinal Kroll. When years later, I'm like around 22, and we went to an old Latin Mass circuit when we became aware of this, and it was a Polish priest, and his name was, he's deceased, Father Victor Moros. He was an order Franciscan. He was saying Mass down near Philadelphia, and a friend of ours who was one of the coordinators for that parish, Lance, he goes and he's a school teacher for the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, high school teacher, and he's at some conference, and somebody there at this reception with Cardinal Kroll, and they know what he's working with, and they go to Cardinal Kroll. When are you going to do something about that priest that's saying that old Latin Mass down there near Philadelphia? When are you going to do something about him? He says, I'm not going to do anything about him, because those people that go to his Mass in good conscience fulfill their obligation to hear Mass on Sunday.
Well, you said it. Yeah, I appreciate that.
So my point, to answer your question,
yes.
We had a decent bishop in Philadelphia. Our pastor was obedient. There was no heresy come out of his mouth, as far as anybody ever said to me, of the adults, because they would have caught on fast.
But I mean,
after his
I guess it's unfair, because we can look back because we're living through the results of this,
right.
And I guess at the time, would you say what? I mean, why wouldn't they have a natural aversion to this stuff? I mean, it just seems. Looking back, and I'll be fair, Philip. I'm going to be fair to these blessed priests and bishops.
Right.
I'm going to be fair to them, because I'm just laity. I'm not going to judge anybody, but it just seems to me that it's such an obvious thing that this is not to happen.
Yes. Well, it is. I'll give it to you this way. It is obvious.
But is it obvious only to us now?
You got to understand the laity, from my perspective, being a blue-collar family.
Right.
We didn't even possess a Bible. I mean, I never saw a Bible till I was a teenager.
Now, the Protestants will criticize you for that.
I'm not criticizing it. That's just
no. I'm just joking.
The people didn't have money.
Right.
That we had our prayer book, our missal. We read our Gospels. We read our epistles. We knew how to pray the Rosary.
Right.
But we didn't have publications. It's just the way it was.
Right.
The laity were so conditioned that they had no fear of what the clergy were doing. They were dumbed down deliberately. The clergy were dumbed down deliberately.
By who? In what way?
Well, they were dumbed down by their superiors, because they didn't learn about many things they should have. I'll give you one example.
Yes, please.
Now, this was one that came to me. When St. Pius X was Pope, we all know as traditional Catholics that he issued the encyclical against modernism, and he had the syllabus of errors, right?
Right.
But one of the things most people don't know is he also issued a directive to the bishops, all the bishops, that they were to establish in every parish a vigilance committee. And the vigilance committee was supposed to be made up of laymen in the parish who were solid practicing Catholic. No divorce could be on the vigilance committee. And preferably married men who were watching. And if the priest, it wasn't a case if he said something wrong. If he wasn't doing his duty to properly
So your point is that these bishops were given this instruction by the Pope, and they ignored it. They didn't create it.
They ignored it. It was never done. It's never been done, as far as I know, except in the diocese where St. Pius X came from.
Interesting. That is fascinating.
And I learned that from another traditional Catholic who met visited his birthplace and everything when he was in the U.S. Navy, and he was a convert from the Lutheran Church.
Now, why would these bishops ignore that order? Because they were already seated.
That's right.
They were already secret, either handshakers or modernists.
Well, look, it's like this. Pius X had to issue the encyclical against modernism and have the syllabus of errors and have them take an oath against the syllabus, all the errors, because they were already imbued with it in Europe. They wouldn't listen to him. They were full of pride. There was only a few bishops and cardinals that were on the ball. A few. Now, maybe I'm wrong in saying no bishop ever instituted it. Maybe there were a few, but never in the United States was it ever done.
That is fascinating.
And the whole point is that they'll come around and say, well, look, we were an immigrant church. They were trying to provide the sacraments and build the church up, yes. But you would think they would have really taught people their faith a little better than they did. Now, I did find that some people moved into this area who came up from Philadelphia. We're up in the hinder regions of the diocese, we'll say.
Okay.
And they really knew the faith a lot better than we did up here. So, did they keep the better priests for down in Philadelphia and send the lax ones up here? We just don't know. That's the way we looked at it, Plain and simple,
Right.
And mind you, my mother and father were married by my mother's first cousin who was a Catholic priest. So it's not that I'm anti-Catholic priest or anti-clerical.
No. I know that. You don't have to worry about that. No, see, I get that. I get accused of that myself because I've been known to. There's a Father Cicada who's a traditionalist priest, and I've been known that they like to say, "Hey, I'm a priest. You don't get to criticize me," and I'm saying that's not true.
Father, what's his last name? Cicada.
Cicada, yeah.
All right.
Yes. Let's not go there. That's not the point. The point is that I got accused of anti-clericalism because I would say the point is, you see, I'm in a construction crew, right? So every person on the team of the crew to get the job done has a duty to do. And I'm not saying they're not capable of it, but if they're not doing it, I'm going to tell you, you're not doing your job. And a priest who's not doing his job is going to hear from me, you're not doing your job. That doesn't mean I'm anti-cleric. It means I understand his mission better than him, apparently.
Well, it's like this, Joe. It's been my observation that one of the mistakes the traditionalists have made is they want to rebuild the church the way it was before Vatican II.
Excellent point, Philip.
That's
excellent
a mistake.
Point.
Because if they want to rebuild it the way it was then, that's why we got such a mess we're in now, is the way it was then.
Exactly my point. I've made that point for years, and I'm not. You made it so eloquently. I appreciate it because the thing was that the people were, I don't know, I guess too obedient. It was like a false obedience, and I know this, and this has been discussed.
As I like to say, it's pay, pray, and obey.
Right, and don't question.
That's the way if you question, you raise a question about what they're doing, right away, it's, you're anti-Catholic. You're not a good Catholic.
Right.
Not a minute, wait a minute, maybe I'm doing something wrong.
Right.
And let me tell you, I have lived through an awful lot of that.
Well, this is why we're talking to you, Philip. This is why we're talking to you. This is excellent. Okay, let's go back then. Now that we've gone off on that, so here we are. They've renovated the church. You said it took about a year at your parish, although I've heard in some parishes it was much quicker. But let's just say at yours it took
Well,
longer.
they didn't do all the work that was done, you know. And quite frankly, someone not knowing better, and even looking at the picture now of how the church looked after it was renovated under Father Begley, it was beautiful.
Well, he did a good job as opposed to some of the people who turned him into these
That's right.
ugly.
That's right.
So at
That's
least he gave
exactly
it his
correct.
best shot to keep it Catholic as it could be.
That's what his effort.
Listen, I was.
He still had a Catholic sense about himself. See,
I, I
he was reading the directives as a Catholic priest should.
well, as I was recently as a personal experience, I had a funeral of a very good friend, and I went to a church in the area, Holy Savior. I'm not going to tell you where it is, but I think you know of it. It's in around King of Prussia area.
Okay, yeah.
Holy Savior Church. It was beautiful inside. It was still beautiful inside. It had the Novus Ordo altar facing the people, but it still had its original altar in the back wall. And that's an Italian parish, very Italian. But so it was beautiful. So it was obviously that there were some priests who did in their small weak way the best they could to try and hold on to something and not let them flush it all.
Yeah, either that, or there wasn't the money there to do an extravagant renovation or
I don't call it
demolition,
renovation.
depending on how you want to word it. I do recall some years ago, 40 some years ago, how in the church, there was an altar in a church in Rome. I don't remember what church it was now, but it was the altar put there by St. Pius V. And they had this altar ripped out and removed.
My gosh.
And the people went to the Historical Society of Rome, and the church was ordered to put it back and had to put it back exactly as it was because it was a historical monument.
Yeah, well, maybe there's something there for
So
people.
As the priest who relayed the story, he says, or when the story was relayed to us, he says, sometimes render it unto Caesar, it works out pretty good.
That's very well said. All right, so okay, let's now what were your parents' reaction without I don't want to go too far down this path, but generally, what was your parents' reaction as these changes came in that year where they were changing the church around?
There was nothing that could be done about it.
No, I understand that, but I mean, at the supper table, was it discussed? Was it?
Oh, well, the only thing again was mother saying, the mass would always be in Latin, and my father, if there's something wrong, it's their sin.
Right.
It's not my sin what they're doing. If they're doing something wrong, especially later on when we became aware of what they did with the prayers, he would simply say, "It's their sin. They're the ones that changed it. We didn't."
Right, because we're laity. People forget.
That's right.
We got a lot. We have. It's my theory that we have a lot of Americanist pollution in our thinking as Catholics in today's world. That we think we're equal to priests and bishops in many of our opinions, which is a hugely Protestant opinion or worldview, and that, like you said, it's a double-edged sword. So if I say I'm not a Protestant, I trust my hierarchy to a point. Therefore, but on the other hand, I'm not responsible for their mistakes. I'm laity. I'm the sheep. The shepherd will be judged for this, not the sheep. Do you believe with that?
Depends.
Go ahead.
Because we are judged upon the knowledge God gives us.
Correct.
That's the church's solid teaching. You know, if you don't know something's wrong,
right,
you can't be held accountable for it. If you know something's wrong and you're limited what you can do, and you don't do what you're limited in your ability to do, don't do anything, well, you'll be accountable for that. If you are able to do a whole lot and you don't do anything, you'll be held accountable for a lot more. And if you do well with the knowledge you have to help preserve the faith, God will reward you well for that.
Well, I think it's a little bit of what we're trying to do today, right, Philip?
That's my hope, is for everyone, Joe, to understand this didn't just happen at the snap of the fingers. This was very slow and creeping.
I remember when I was a young boy in high school, I wrote this fictional short story that it was kind of like a horror story, but it pertains to this. I didn't know about any of this, but it was just an idea I had that was very scary to me. Was these aliens came down, they put these statues at the four corners of the earth, and everybody thought, oh, how wonderful, and they sat there and they looked at them, and they didn't seem to be doing any harm to anything, so they just thought it was wonderful, and they stopped caring, and they ignored them. But one guy noticed they were moving an inch at a time towards the center of the earth, 1 inch over. See my point? So it's like this creeping horror coming, and then because they're moving so slow and so determined that you don't perceive a threat.
I remember, and then of course, surprise, surprise, it wasn't just the church misinforming the Catholics. You had the secular media in there propagandizing the people just like they are now, only it was much more subtle.
Well, let's remember, this is a very salient point that people maybe don't bring into account, but this was the early and first age of television. This was the first age. Yeah, this is the first age of this technology that people think benign, but it's not benign, not at all.
Well, in our parish, then after the refurbishing, during the refurbishing, we had to stand because everything was ripped apart, and there was dirt and scaffolding and everything all over the place. And after this, we never were able to kneel down again. The communion rail was there, but they had it was all hard marble. There was no place to kneel down for the people, so the people stood. And
were you instructed? Were you instructed by the priest to do that, to come down the center aisle like
That's right. That's right. And then of course the news media said, "Oh, women no longer have to have their heads covered in church." Well, my mother and my grandmother and my aunts, they were among the last ones that would not change, and they never. My mother and grandmother never did. And
well, we have to give credit to the laity where they could do things like that, like well, obviously it's very difficult. Some ladies still do it to their great courage. They'll actually kneel when they come up to the line, and then there's people, obviously families who wear the mantilla properly. And what is the other one? They refuse to take it in the hand. They will stick out their tongue.
Oh, that's right. And of course, I remember my mother. We were going past another church in another county on our way to the old mass one Sunday, and I said, "Look," as we're going by, and our aunt and one cousin were going in pantsuit. And here, my mother looked at this, and she says to me, "Now, Philip, don't you say a word. I'll handle this." And so here, she's the middle of the week. She's, "Oh, take me over to your aunt's house. And you don't say a word. You let me do the talking. You go in and visit with Uncle." And so I sat there, and I'm talking to Uncle. My mother goes in and sits down at the table, dining room table, with my aunt and my cousin, her niece, and she says, "I tell you, it's just terrible how things are going in the church nowadays." She says, "What would Mother say if she were to see this now? They don't not just come into church with not having their heads covered. Now they come into church in pants." That's all she and always came to church dressed modestly, old-fashioned again, like they always did before Vatican II.
So you see,
But,
the thing was that it was like busting loose the dam of, and it
there's
just
no
opened it up.
standards.
No.
See, and you got to realize, this is where we came to the conclusion over the years of careful prayer and thought, Joe. Every one of these problems that we've hardly even touched on at this time
Right.
can all be directed back to the full message of Our Lady at Fatima.
Amen.
They have ignored this. They do not want to hear it. It's away with the Blessed Mother. And as one priest, Polish priest, who would come and bring my grandmother communion, he's deceased now. His name was Father Michael Jarecki. Many people will recognize his name. He would come to bring my grandmother communion. And I remember one of his quick little sermons. It was a gem. He says, stay close to Our Lady, because only one apostle was very close to Our Lady, and he was at the foot of the cross when all the rest ran away.
Right.
And that's where we want to be, close to Our Lady in all this, and she'll keep us close to our Lord.
Amen. Now listen, so, okay, now here we are. Now the priest has instructed people. The priest, what was the first Sunday when the priest faced the people like?
Well, it just seems strange.
Right.
But, again, I was there serving Mass, and you still had prayers at the foot of the altar, like I said, and then he would go off to the side and go around and go up and kiss the altar, just like he would be going up the altar steps direct to kiss the altar, and then he would go over and he would open up the gospel book, and he would start saying the prayers. There was a crucifix on the altar in the center, or it was standing on a stand right, There was candles on the altar. Everything was still on the altar at that point.
But it was in English.
That was there pre-Vatican II.
Right, but it was in English.
It was all English. Okay. And there was no concern. Father's doing this.
Right.
It must
Here we
be
go.
okay.
Right.
Father wouldn't mislead us, and certainly the bishop wouldn't mislead Father. And now we had one old neighbor. This will be a point. She was a shut-in during the whole time of the gradual creeping changes.
Okay.
She went to Mass after the changes were complete one Sunday. She came home bawling. She saw it for what it was. She just cried and cried.
Horrible. I have nightmares like that for my Eastern church.
Yes.
I have nightmares where I know I'm in the church, and everything's whitewashed. Everything's like white paint all over everything.
Oh, guess what? That's what they did with my parish after we left there. They white painted everything.
Hey, I agree.
Beautifully. It's horrible.
No, I agree. I've seen it. You know where I saw that? When I was working at Villanova in Philadelphia as a painter. They literally painted everything flat white. Every statue, it was the most nightmarish thing I've ever seen.
Joe, it was like we got to get rid of as much of the past as possible, because we really don't believe like they did.
When now we're at the time frame in your life with the changes, when we're at the place where the priest is now facing the people, speaking, and it's the Novus Ordo Mass as we know it today, or?
Well, not yet. Still not yet.
Okay, what is it?
It was a hybrid. It was between English and Latin. Maybe they had the Latin for the canon, but all the prayers at the foot of the altar were shortened, and they were all in English, what pertained to us. You follow me?
Yes.
And then they went, and I know I have some prayer cards here, at least I think I do somewhere as yet, where it shows how you're supposed to answer, the Latin parts,
Right.
And they still have the Latin. Now,
well, what was this called? What was this, Matt? Was this the Novus Ordo promulgated by Paul VI, or was this some interim ad hoc? It was.
This was an interim adaptions.
Like ad hoc.
We're going to allow this to be done. We're going to allow the prayers at the foot of the altar to be shortened. We're going to allow the prayers to be Englishized. Then, it was baby steps. You follow me?
Right. So, but meanwhile, what? Bugnini's Mass is being formed in Vatican right now as this is going on.
Yeah, it was being formed by the progressives / the modernists. Was it 6 Protestant ministers who sat on the commission also? That we were unaware of all of this.
Right.
We had
That's
no
an important
knowledge
point.
this was going on.
That's an important point because it's easy to judge looking back.
Right.
But you obviously, because let's not forget, like today we take for granted so much information at our fingertips. That back then, what did you have? Maybe news, maybe a newspaper, maybe some clips on television once in a while, if you had a television. So, yeah.
Again, it was like my parents, the only Catholic publication they got in their home was the Little Mission magazine from Bishop Fulton Sheen up in New York. That was the only thing they got. There was nothing else. No heavy reading material. It just didn't exist. They were unaware of it. This is just the way it was,
Right.
And the things didn't exist, The only thing my parents made sure of was they went into church, into the vestibule, and they had a list of the movies. And if it said condemned, we didn't go to that. They went to look to see what was on the list that we could take us safely to see if they wanted to take us to a movie.
Oh boy.
And that was only maybe once a year, So
those days are so far gone. Oh my gosh.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so let's move on then. So all right, so you're maybe what? So how long did it take before the full Novus Ordo showed up at your parish?
I'm 14 and a half. It's the first Sunday in Advent, 1969.
And did that happen, like one Sunday was this ad hoc version, and then the following Sunday was the full Novus Ordo?
I guess that's about right, but I can't say for certain anymore. Well, we were already saying the new Mass, but it was officially promulgated that it had to go into effect the first Sunday in Advent, 1969. The reason they picked that Sunday, was because it was the beginning of the liturgical year for the Western Church.
What was the feast day again?
It would be the first Sunday of Advent.
Oh,
4 Sundays before Christmas.
Right. Okay.
The Advent season is shorter in the Western Church than the Eastern Church, and the Eastern Church starts Advent on St. Philip's feast, the Apostles' feast day, November 14th, no matter where it falls.
Right.
Which is November 14th, as I said. So we have 6 Sundays for the pre-Christmas season, or St. Philip's fast. They only have 4 Sundays. Oh, there's one other thing that they done that I forgot to mention. Two other things they done.
Go ahead.
That were things that we spotted early on. First of all, they eliminated the Ember Days.
Altogether?
They're called Ember Days.
Right.
And they're fast days, and they occur 4 times in the church year of the Roman Rite.
How did they eliminate them? Did they just proclaim from the
altar?
altar?
They were no longer there. They were taken off the church calendar, and these feasts, we in time learned, were there from the time of the apostles. They were apostolic origin.
Right. Okay, what was the other changes?
And the other change was then they eliminated all the fast days in Lent. went except Wednesday, Ash Wednesday, and Friday, Good Friday. And they eliminated all the days of abstinence except the mandatory ones on the Fridays of Lent. They eliminated the fast and abstinence the day before the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, Christmas Eve, and Pentecost. And some dioceses, it was also the day before All Saints' Day, but it wasn't here in the Diocese of Philadelphia in my lifetime. It maybe was much earlier, but it had long been eliminated. And these days, these 4 weeks were real important because, as I recall, right after that was when they consecrated a bishop. That was the normal time to consecrate a bishop. And so the whole church was
interesting.
praying.
That's interesting.
And they ordained a priest. It was right before the Feast of St. Peter and Paul.
So and you could see...
the whole church was praying for the new ordinations and the new consecrations of bishops, and this was eliminated.
So you could see, in reference to our Lord's words about certain evil not being able to be removed without fasting and prayer.
Prayer and fasting.
Correct. And then, when we get new bishops and priests, at that time, just before then, the church almost as a whole has done the fasting and praying. So it is a good fountain of grace to bring us good shepherds, right?
That's right.
So by eliminating them, we weaken it.
Right. And also they eliminated, when I made First Communion in 1963, the fast was for 3 hours. It had already been reduced from midnight. And I was allowed to take water. Whereas my parents, they still persisted in the way they were trained in my grandmother into her old age till she was too sick at home. They never took a drop of water after midnight when they were going to communion, let alone anything to eat.
Right. So we see, Philip, that you're like right at the center of the storm when this blew through town, so to speak.
That's right.
Now, so the Novus Ordo now, okay, so now you're going to the Novus Ordo. I'm sorry to rush you a little bit. I'm just trying to get to...
More meat and potatoes.
No, we're doing great. This is some of the best interviews I've had. We're getting up to the point, so now, let's just fast forward then. So when did it become a point where that's it, that's enough, we're gone?
Well, this is how it was creeping for me.
Right.
It was...
I mean, did your parents stay... Your parents didn't stay with the Novus Ordo the whole time?
My father stayed almost to the end of his life.
Okay.
Now, this is the way it happened for me. I'll have to back into this.
Yeah, this is interesting because I like to see just the everyday Catholic's family dealing with this. This is exactly what I was curious about.
Now, first of all, we figured out by this time Father Begley was gone. He was gone. All the good priests were gone. And you had a couple of real not so great priests up there. By that I mean they really weren't orthodox in everything they said or did. Okay? And people started objecting, but we didn't know about it yet fully. We were just at the edge of it. So let's see now. In 1973, in March, so at that point, I'm 18. I was introduced through this old neighbor. She was the intermediate for me to someone else into conspiratorial history. And I started to read everything I could get my hands on this subject.
Well, we don't need to go completely down that path, but we will have
I just mentioned that because
I understand. It's important. No, I get it.
It's important because it's going to explain something in a moment.
Okay.
Now we come fast forward. Now, this was March of 73. come Christmas Eve of 1973, I'm the only one at home. All the rest of the family is out, and I sit down and watch the ABC News, and it's Harry Reasoner and Howard K. Smith, I think is the other one was. And Harry, they had one thing, Latin Mass. I says, oh, I'm going to sit and watch this. And here it had about, Harry Reasoner had a report about the priests still saying the old Latin Mass in Connecticut, and the priests were a Father Robert McKenna, deceased, and who was a Dominican, and a Father Francis C. Fenton, who was a diocesan priest, deceased also now of the Diocese of Bridgeport. And I knew right away who this Father Fenton was, because he was one of the writers I read, who was one of the speakers exposing different parts of the conspiratorial history. And so I thought, well, all I saw was they were still having the old Latin Mass, and the church was packed, and the people were so happy. And I said, well, this is what my grandmother and mother said was supposed to be. So I had a personal friend who's now deceased. You know who he is? John, who worked for the phone company.
Good God bless his soul.
He knew who Father Fenton was too, because he was one of my teachers in the conspiratorial history.
And you were one of mine.
And it ends up, I says, can you find where he is? And it ends up, he got me a brochure. Father Fenton sent us a brochure called Holding Fast. And they took the part from Scripture from 2 Thessalonians. Hold fast to the traditions which you have received. And there's more to the story, but that's how I ultimately became a traditionalist. It was the next year that I really got educated in tradition, and then by the fall of...
Basically, we could say you got educated in Catholicism.
Well, that's right. There is no such thing as a traditional Catholic. All Catholics are supposed to be traditional, because the way our faith is preserved and passed down to us is through two sources, as the Western Church says, which is Scripture and tradition. And the Eastern Church says there's only one source, Scripture and tradition. And it doesn't contradict. It's right on target, because the Scripture is the tradition of the church.
It is. Yep, people forget that.
If it wouldn't be for the Catholic Church, there wouldn't be any Scripture.
Right, the word tradition from traditio meaning to hand forward. So handing forward the Bible from one person to the next is a tradition.
That's
so
right.
You tell your Protestants that, and their heads explode. So, all right, well, let's get back on track then. So, you've learned the, what do you call it, the conspiratorial, what was that? What's that term?
Conspiratorial history.
I love that. That is that is the best euphemism.
If there's a conspiratorial history in government, there might be conspiratorial history against what's happening to our church.
Well, it goes back to the Garden of Eden, obviously, that conspiracy, but
the devil conspired with himself on that one.
Right, so conspiratorial history, that's my most favorite, that's my new favorite euphemism. I'm going to be writing that one down, Philip. Can I take that? Can I steal that from you?
What was that?
The conspiratorial history euphemism. Can I steal that?
Oh, yeah, because after all, as one priest explained it to me, all conspiracy is Luciferian history.
Excellent. So, okay. So here we are. You've learned that there's something afoot. Beyond what you're being told, what the modern kids might call, you were given the, I believe it's the blue pill for the Matrix. In other words, your eyes were opened. Something's going on here bigger than I thought.
That's something, and one of the people who I got to meet in New England when I went up there.
So you went to Connecticut?
Well, I went to Connecticut after I graduated on October 1st, the Feast of Our Lady's Protection and Our Lady's Month of the Holy Rosary. That's when I went to Connecticut. And I met Father Fenton. I met that day first. The first person I met became a good friend of mine for over 40 years till he passed away 2 years ago this year, John Fergali.
Mm-hmm.
And he came and picked me up at the bus stop. But at any rate, I lived up there for about 6 months.
Wow.
And
so here you are now. Now you're, I guess, what would you call it? An independent Latin chapel, or what was its?
That Our Lady of the Rosary Chapel it's still there. It's in Monroe, Connecticut. They were one of the early Traditionalist centers in the country, not the first.
Right.
Not nowhere near the first. But I didn't know about those until later on.
Right, but I mean, what was their status, would they say? Were they independent, or were they...
They were independent of the local bishop.
Okay.
And their whole position, their organization that they founded was called the ORCM, an acronym for Orthodox Roman Catholic Movement. And their bylaws simply stated, and simply put, was and remains so till their organization disbanded. But their position simply was they will accept no liturgical changes after the death of Pius XII.
Now, would that put them in a seat of a Cantist camp, or a resistor?
They were not sedevacantists.
They were resisting?
They just simply said the Pope is there, and if he says something that's correct,
right. So they were resistors.
We will agree with it.
Right.
But otherwise, we'll just ignore it.
Right. Well, okay. Yeah, I didn't mean to enter that in. I'm just trying to get.
There's a whole. Give it an explanation of their position.
Right. There's a whole vague knowledge of what the landscape of the early resistance, early traditionalists, early Catholic reactors, if you will, what it looked like.
The early Catholic reaction was
the true Catholics, I should say.
Yeah, it was everybody. It was like the one elderly priest in our area. I'll mention him because he's deceased. They can't do nothing to him. His name was Father Robert Reedy.
Right, Father Reedy. I met him. Yes.
Yes, he was pastor of St. Joseph's. When the new mass came out, his housekeeper of many years stopped going to mass. And he says, "Why aren't you going to mass?" And she says, "Well, I'm not going to that. They've changed the consecration." He says, "What do you mean they've changed the consecration?" She says, "What do you mean, what do you mean?" She says, "Why don't you look at your book?" And he went in, he checked his book. Well, his jaw hit the desktop. He couldn't believe how they pulled the wool over his eyes. So Father Reedy, he started making changes on his own. And he'd say their consecration, and then you'd see him up there, his mouth started going. He was saying the old words in Latin over the bread and the chalice then. He didn't trust anything they were doing.
Well, let me ask you a question. This is a big issue, the authority issue. How did they justify their quote-unquote disobedience?
Oh, the priests?
I guess. I mean, obviously we can't get into the heart and minds of other people.
You mean their obedience? Or their disobedience?
Their disobedience.
The reason for Father McKenna, and this is what he called Satan's syllogism. I tell you, the changes are good. The churches approve the changes. The changes are good. The churches approve the changes. Therefore, the changes are good. He says, this is Satan's syllogism. Behold how they hold the whole world in their hands, if I'm saying it right anymore. He says, I tell you, the changes are manifestly wrong. Therefore, the changes cannot be good. Therefore, the church can really not have really approved them.
Correct.
That was Father McKenna's point.
And you realize, though, that's basically the Sedevacantist
See,
position.
and the Spanish maxim is, obedience is the servant of the faith. The faith is not the servant of obedience.
Well said. But you understand, I'm just trying to clarify something. You understand that's the basic position of the Sedevacantist, is that these things didn't come from the church.
Well, in the sense that's correct. You know, you can be right on a whole lot. It's when you go off on the wrong way, you're still wrong. You know.
Yeah, right.
It's you can go to the wrong way to the left, and you can go to the wrong way to the right. Our Lord said, "Straight as narrow is the path."
Right.
And here, like Father McKenna and Father Fenton at that time, look, we don't need approval for saying the old Latin Mass.
They're
we
right.
have the papal bull, Quo Primum.
Right.
And to this day, Quo Primum has never been repealed.
And Benedict himself basically said the same thing, right?
Well, not only that, Pope John Paul II, he had a commission established. And the commission had two questions put before it. The questions were, was Quo Primum ever repealed? Yes or no?
Right.
And could it be ever repealed? And there was 9 cardinals put on this commission. And I believe the way the ruling was it was never repealed. And I think 8 of them said it could never be repealed.
Well, let's get back to the timeline now. So you spent your 6 months becoming aware and learning something that's opening your eyes. So you come back to your home parish. What happened?
Well, as soon as I came back, I went to the Ukrainian church.
What made you say that was okay to do? I'm glad that you did, but just to fill us in.
The reason was twofold. First of all, now that was from, as I said, the 1st of October till March, somewhere in there. So it's not a full 6 months, but that's about the time frame. Somewhere in March, the middle of March.
And we can say this is actually the parish I attend today, correct?
Yes, it is.
Go ahead.
And we went there. At that
Who's
time,
we?
I was still learning.
Who's we, Philip?
Pardon?
Who's we, Philip? When you say we came back?
I mean me and other Catholics.
Okay.
The Traditionalist.
Okay.
It wasn't any member of my family yet at that moment.
Okay.
The conclusion was the Ukrainians were probably the most conservative. I had been at my current parish one time as a teenager, taken there by my home Roman parish to see an Easter Rite liturgy.
Right, this was the Byzantine Ruthenians, correct?
That's right. And see, they were standing for communion, whereas the Ukrainians still knelt for communion then.
At a communion rail?
No, there was never a communion rail in the Ukrainian church.
Okay, how did they do it? They walked up and then
along the step up there, to the right and left of the tetrapod and the pulpit. So they all knelt there, and the priest walked back and forth, and gave communion. And the pastor, he's very old. If he's still alive, they can't do anything to him anymore. His name was Father Petrilak, a most wonderful priest, a wonderful confessor. And I went there first, and I was talking to my parents and my other siblings. My one brother was to graduate that year. So that summer, in August 1st of 1975, myself, my mother, and my one brother went by train back to New England. And we met with Father Fenton. And he sat down with my mother, and he answered all her questions. And he told her, she says, I was taught, Father, it would always be in Latin. He says, that's right. And he says, it's not so much the language the problem is, it's they've gotten rid of 75% of the prayers. That's even worse. And the 25% they have left, they've Protestantized. And of course, they falsified the consecration of the chalice. And so that was enough. And we came back home. And from that time on, my mother would not go back to our home parish anymore. She went to the Ukrainian church. And subsequently, when I went there were no books available, and I would go only to the liturgy in Old Slavonic. There was no book available to me, but I knew it was right, and I just listened and learned.
Right, and you saw probably the physical parts of it were familiar to you.
Yes, yes. And here, then Father Petrolet, he sat down with us, and there was a book they were using at the 8 o'clock, two books, a gray book and a little blue book.
Did you have to receive permission from your bishop to leave your former
we didn't ask for any permission.
No.
We didn't leave. Besides, we didn't leave what we were baptized in. We left something that was entirely different.
Interesting.
And so my mother, she's there in church, and different times they start singing hymns. She suddenly knows every word they're saying.
Wow.
And we adapted. And then in the course of about 4.5, 5 years, something like that, we decided to transfer over to the Byzantine parish because there were more people that knew our family.
Sure.
And it was very close to my home.
Sure, I know that. Yeah, as a personal, I can give personal testimony that it's much more convenient to your home.
Yes, and our grandma. It turns out and then, of course, what was so interesting to us, we didn't know at the time how my grandmother kept all the holy days just like the Greek Catholic Church did. You don't wash on or do any servile work on St. John the Baptist's birthday. She kept all the holy days exact. You don't eat meat or dairy on Good Friday. Never did. Subsequently now, after my mother passed away 5 years ago, talking to her second cousin in Ohio, we learned we're part Ukrainian and we never knew it. And this was passed down to us through the family, through my grandmother's family. And we did live in the same district right there at the border, between the Ukrainians and the Poles.
I have a question. Philip, what kept you from leaving the church altogether or becoming disheartened or scandalized by what was going on? And instead of, let me try to clarify that so it's a clearer question for you. What I mean is that when this went on and you went up there and you came back here, you could have just as easily just thrown up your hands and say the whole thing's a racket. This is just not nonsense. I don't know what to do, Lord. I'm just going home. And I know that's a drastic position, but I just want to point it out because I think there's something important about the grace of our baptisms and our confirmations that still live in us, and then in these times, especially in 2018, where things are totally horrible, that we can rely on, we can still hope with. But go ahead.
I can answer that question very much. First of all, when I was in high school, the fundamentalists almost had me. But there were two things I would not give up. I would not give up my belief in the real presence of our Lord in the Eucharist, because I know he didn't say, this represents, he said, this is my body. And the second thing was, I would not stop wearing the scapular. I remained devoted to Our Lady. The third thing was the example of my grandmother and my mother in the praying of the rosary and in devotion to Our Lady. The fourth thing was everything that had surrounded my life. My father had said to me how he saw this professor on TV who was a devout Catholic. and they said, and he was considered great, and they were interviewing him, and he said, what do you think for your son? He says, I don't care if he's a ditch digger, so long as he keeps the faith. And this mattered immensely to my parents, that we remain Catholic. They set the example. My father married my mother because she went to confession and communion every week and never missed Mass. My mother married my father because he never missed Mass, and he went to confession and communion every 2 weeks from the time he came home from World War II.
What possible inroads could the fundamentalists have had with you at this time? Besides the ones that you wouldn't reject, but what was it that slightly
it was
appealed?
The matter of you have to be saved.
Okay.
You see, and of course the problem is that we're so poorly schooled in our faith. We're not taught. We're not taught hardly anything.
Well, I mean, as in context of the changes that went on in the modernism.
Oh well, that is the sense that, well, if I would have, I believe that God allowed me to become a traditional Catholic with a small t.
Remain a traditional Catholic.
Remain a traditional Catholic with a capital T.
Right.
With a capital C. He had me become that because that was the only way I was going to save my soul.
And survive.
Mm-hmm.
Right, I mean, this is my
totally
point.
A gift from God. It wasn't anything I did actually on my part, other than wearing the scapular and not giving up my belief in the Eucharist.
Well, on a closing note, I think that's something that I think many of the modern so-called traditionalists have forgotten, that they actually think that they were the ones that were so smart to figure this out, and now they're building up, extra ecclesial parishes, and they're creating groups. And they're forgetting that the only reason that they survived was by the very depth and mercy and grace of God, and no other reason. No intellect, no. I don't see why I made it out. Looking at my life, I don't deserve any. I mean, it's interesting you said the things that kept you from rejecting Catholicism altogether from the fundamentalists. I was big in the pro-life movement, and I was a big neoconservative for a while. And in that political movement during the Reagan eras, the fundamentalists were out, picketing and doing the whole pro-life stuff, which is good. But, obviously they were also evangelizing. Oh, you're a Catholic. Oh, this, that. Oh, you don't read the Bible. I agreed with a lot of what they said, because looking around, the Catholics I saw were just these, mumbly mouth, Novus Ordo. They had no, with all due respect, accepting the ones that were at the pro-life rallies, they were very devout. But my general concept of Catholicism at the time was very weak, and the fundamentalists seemed, when my heart was open to believe in God again, for whatever reason, my children obviously, that they had an inroad of the fundamentalists, except, like you said, I couldn't get over the idea of a sacred space as church as a sacred thing, as opposed to just a place you hung out and spoke about your feelings about God. And I couldn't give up Mary. I just didn't see how that's possible. It made no sense to me to give that up. So, like you said, these are two little mustard seeds that our Lord planted with no help from me, and watered with no help from me, that after I met you, Philip, you poured the water on, baby.
I was just the faucet for
Right.
God's mercy. That's it. I turned it on a little bit, and you done the rest.
And look at the trouble we caused, Phil. Look at the trouble.
Well, yeah. Every time I think of all the headaches my godson causes, yeah.
All right, Philip, I think on that note, I think you've done a great thing here. You've given a real history that people don't get to hear about much, especially in the modern traditionalist movements. They've almost forgotten our vanguard. They've forgotten the people who went before them, the suffering, the change, the how their mindset was. And many are very judgmental of the early Catholics for not fighting this. But I think you've created the perfect uh, context for them to be more merciful about the whole idea. Would you say?
Joe, our ancestors persevered in the Catholic faith, and they came to this country with nothing. And the Lord allowed them to build up magnificent churches. And in 3 to 5 generations, everything came collapsing down in a period of about 20 years.
Right.
And it's just accelerated since. So, talking about this, I've discussed this with other people, like Lenny from the Order of St. John. I'll say that much. And our policy is now, mine and others, many others, when we meet somebody, the first thing we have to do is get them devoted to Our Lady.
Right.
Our Lady, the Rosary, and the Scapular. This is the age that Our Lady is going to triumph in. If Fatima is going to be fully fulfilled, and if they get close to Our Lady, then they'll be receptive to learn the rest of the truth. But it's so complicated.
Yes.
It's so terribly distorted.
Yes.
The first thing we have to do is to get Catholics to pray the Rosary and wear the Scapular. And if they do that, they're helping Our Lady's triumph come. And if they're devoted to Our Lady will take care of the rest.
I'm going to close on that, Philip. And thank you very much. And I'm glad you're my brother, and I love you very much.
Same here. And that's all for now.